All right, this round is being recorded. You guys are all aware of it, right?
Correct.
Cool.
That's okay with phones timing? To time with our phone. Phone's ready? Both judges ready? Brian? Congratulations for both teams on making it to California Cup. We'd like to congratulate both our opponents and commend ourselves for making it this far. The resolution that was given to us was the Kurdish Regional Government should declare independence from Iraq. And the Kurdish Regional Government, which we will be going by as the KRG, is considered the rallying body of Iraqi Kurdistan, which includes provinces of Erbil, Duhok, and Silimani. And the state of Iraq is known as the Republic of Iraq. And we, the affirmation, provide this following plan to uphold the resolution. As this is a planned resolution, we declare this policy. The KRG should declare independence from Iraq and initiate negotiations with the Iraqi government to reach an agreement upon the share profit of oil sales from Iraqi Kurdistan. And with that plan in mind, is there any clarifications thus far that the opposition has that they need? Could you repeat that, please? Okay. The plan is the KRG, the Kurdish Regional Government, should declare independence from Iraq and initiate negotiations with the Iraqi government to reach an agreement upon the share profit of all oil sales from Iraqi Kurdistan. The weighing mechanism that we provide for today's debate is net benefits. So if we did affirmation to show you that on net, the benefits that are coming off of upholding this plan and the advantages outweigh those of the negation, we, the affirmation, believe we should win today's debate. All right, so furthermore, we have two main advantages to why this plan should be upheld and why the affirmative team should win. And the first advantage is that taking into consideration that Iraqi has 75 to 80% of Arab population and that there's a 15 to 20% Kurdish population, the first advantage that we'd like to propose is that it prevents legal conflict over oil deals with other foreign private entities. All right, so right now the Constitution of Kurdistan, and that was also proposed by Baghdad, which is the central ruling party in the Kurdistan-Iraqi region, says that as long as Kurdistan remains a semi-autonomous federal entity, that they can't actually have oil trades with other foreign entities and under a legal binding that the Constitution sets out. And so thus, by actually making them independent parties and independent entities, we make sure that the conflict that's occurred between the separate governments, that we have actually evidence showing how this has actually happened. On November 26th, the Kurdish military forces and Baghdad military forces had a lot of conflict, which have reported at least 10 people killed, and a requirement for an urgent security agreement that was needed to actually fix this problem. And so we can realize that the problem is extremely eminent in today's world, and by making these two parties independent, we make sure that conflict that could arise because of the different oil deals right now that already do arise are prevented in the future. And that's an impact is that the conflict between the government causes violence. Violence causes loss of lives. And a lot of other violence also costs a lot of money for infrastructural developments. The region of Baghdad and Iraq as a whole is already deteriorated because of the Iraq wars, which we're going to get into the next advantage. So by upholding this plan, making these two parties independent, making oil deals and with other private entities legally gain all of these benefits. So the next main advantage that we'd like to propose is that the general economic growth in that region is going to provide a net benefit to not only the people of Kurdistan, but also the people around Kurdistan as well. So right now that we realize that after the Iraq and Afghanistani wars, the region in Iraq has been deteriorated a lot, whether it be economic growth and infrastructural growth that are all destroyed because of this war in an attempt to all get democratic improvement. And so we realize that any more conflict that goes on in this region isn't something that we actually want. And so we realize that by making these two parties independent, we make sure that the poverty and the actual revenue that's gained from these oil agreements that Kurdistan currently gets, but that is condemned by the Baghdad central government, that revenue will be given and prospering throughout the region by having all the different entities that are involved with this trade getting any revenue possible from the actual oil agreements. What this means is that poverty in Iraq goes down, that people can finally have money they need to actually afford the essentials in their life, such as food, infrastructure, and other things that are extremely necessary, water, to do this. Right now, because of the lack of economic growth, because of the lack of jobs, the lack of money, we see that this isn't currently happening. A lot of this is really, it's the actual conflict is deterring any progress in this region. And so by making these parties independent and these states independent of each other, we realize that that benefit comes off as a whole. And the main impact to this is, one, that the US's money that was put towards the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and one of the main reasons was that we wanted democratic development in the region. All the money that we put towards actually trying to solve this problem, that main goal was to have democratic progress so that the people can actually rule the country in which they live in. Terrorists don't have that much ability. That was the whole goal of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and if we can show that by decreasing conflict we guys are able to achieve this better, then we need to realize that the goals that the US initially set are being upheld. And so we realize that the money that the US initially put towards this goal and this actual issue of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that money isn't being gone to waste. And thus we affirm the resolution that the Kurdish Regional Government should declare independence from Iraq.
Judges ready. Opponents ready. Beautiful. Basically, to provide a brief roadmap as to where we will be going onto the flow today, I shall first go over my opponents' cases, their definitions and their advantages, and then I shall move on to my own disadvantages, as well as a critique on the mindset and perhaps something additional should we have the time. Now, essentially what we'd like to go and accept the definitions of KRG and all governing bodies as well as their plan. We'd like to accept the definitions of this plan as we fully understand what they are attempting to do. We would also like to accept their weighing mechanism of net benefits in order to basically judge this round, so that way the judges can have a clear and definitive way for judging this round as one. Moving on to their advantage one. In advantage one, they said that they would prevent legal conflicts by declaring, by having Kurdistan declare itself as independent and thus be a legally separate entity. And so this basically inherently defines essentially, well, the main problem here. We can look to South Sudan and North Sudan, or rather regular Sudan as it prefers to be called, in terms of conflict for its oil. You see here, as South Sudan legally is a separate international entity in which it maintains diplomatic relations with many other countries across the world. However, they still have regional conflicts with the Sudanese government simply because Sudan refuses to acknowledge South Sudan's independence, and even though it is legally recognized as legally separate, it is in fact not acknowledged as something that is actually in all practicality separate. And so you still have contractual conflicts. You still have these conflicts that they have described in their contention. And declaring Kurdistan's independence simply does not solve this problem. Simply because there's no respect between the Kurdish and the Iraqi people, or the Turkish and the Kurdish people. And so because of this, you won't actually see any of their net benefits of increasing the autonomy of Kurdistan, or to increase the legal separation of Kurdistan, simply because, well, no such thing exists in the status quo where we've seen their process be carried out in Sudan. So essentially, they also said is that yes.
So what was the extent of the autonomy of the two different nations of Sudan before their independence was declared?
Excuse me?
So what was the extent to which there was cultural differences between North and South Sudan before independence?
I'm not exactly sure what the extent of the cultural existence between the South Sudanese and the regular Sudanese. All I am sure of is that it was enough to warrant the separation between the two groups and two different nation states, which is essentially what we have here in Kurdistan and Iraq, and as well as Turkey. So now essentially what we're going to go ahead and see here is they also said that they would bring them on equal footing. Well, quite frankly, Iraq being the larger nation state here will be able to easily overpower any independence efforts, thus resulting in a bloody conflict, which we've seen plenty enough of in the Middle East. Especially when you see Kurdistan simply trying to attempt to declare its independence in 1991, which results in the dictator Saddam Hussein brutally crushing the rebellion, and results in the massive exodus of Kurds to simply go to Turkey, and thus result in terrorist bombings and a terror campaign in Turkey to try and promote the cause for independence. So really what we see here is an actual increase in violence, and thus all the impacts that you see here can simply be turned to the negation simply because we actually maintain the status quo in which there is a minimal amount of violence, whereas theirs promotes Kurdish nationalism, which would ultimately result in a new terror campaign being launched. And so basically, we actually gain all these net benefits that they stated in their contention about conflict. Moving on to their second advantage here, which was they basically said that the region of Iraq has deteriorated. So now basically what we see here is that yes, the region of Iraq has in fact deteriorated, and so they said that we don't want new conflicts. Well, as we demonstrated in their first advantage, we clearly show that new conflicts are in fact started all over again, simply because they're promoting Kurdish independence, and because they're promoting Kurdish independence, they thus result in essentially encouraging violence, and thus encouraging many other things among that, including the nationalism, which has presented itself to be extremely dangerous, especially in the Balkan region, as we could see all the way from 1910 all the way up until, well, quite frankly now, with the Yugoslavian wars. So by them promoting nationalism, they essentially encourage an extreme amount of violence. That way it results in an excess of bloodshed, which is exactly what they do not want in their weighing mechanism. So if we look at the weighing mechanism here, we can clearly see that the negation just provided by a refutation is not even and not even our disadvantage, we clearly have shown that, quite frankly, we gain the net benefits here. So essentially, any benefits about how they're currently gaining democracy, and they basically is that they say that the main impact is that they want democracy. Is that the main impact is that they would solve some amount of poverty. Quite frankly, what we see here is that there's two things going on. One is the fact that you're not going to see this redistribution of wealth. You're not going to see this solution to poverty with their resolution simply because there's going to be more regional conflicts going on. Second, essentially another war going on. And then also what we can see here is that we can see the further connection of essentially taking the Middle East and making more and more dependent on its oil, which it quite frankly should not be, because, well, if you look at the way oil has been going now, we're looking for alternative energy, so we're essentially getting them hooked on something which, quite frankly, is going to be disappearing as a market for them. So you basically see their economy collapse again, which of course they will have no choice but to blame Iraq, which essentially signed this oil deal, thus resulting in essentially another war right here. So after they, of course, solve their sovereignty war, they're going to have to get into another oil war for something that's more valuable. Now we're going to go on to our case for our disadvantage. So basically, we're going to provide a clear debate. So to provide a clear debate here, we're going to make some observations about the situation in the Middle East. So right now, it's observation one. Fundamentally, an independent Kurdistan is not likely because it lacks resources and it lacks allies. So Kurdistan is surrounded by essentially hostile countries that would not take too kindly to essentially becoming independent. So now observation two is that Kurdistan exists in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. All these countries have major stakes in maintaining the area of Kurdistan, and because of this, we cannot allow them to become independent because it would result in additional civil war and more essentially regional conflicts that would essentially result in further bloodbaths that have been happening historically, such as in 1991, the Gulf War, and the Turkish suppression of the Kurds in their territory. Now moving on to disadvantage one, the plan leads to genocide. So basically right now here is that we're claiming right here is that right now is that there is a delicate balance between the Kurds and, well, the Iraqis, the Turks, and the Syrians to basically maintain their own kind of territory and their independence. Basically, as we stated before, is that Kurdistan simply does not have the resources or allies to maintain its own defense and lacks the necessary hegemony to maintain that diplomatically. And so because of this, what we see here is that essentially is that when then declaring independence, the warrants here is that we have the 1991 Kurdish rebellion against Saddam Hussein, which then resulted in Saddam Hussein exterminating the Kurds for the most part, and thus resulting in many of them fleeing to Turkey. So basically right here is the impacts of this is that right now is that basically Kurdistan will, of course, remember these regional conflicts before with Saddam Hussein, and then of course by being a nation state, they will essentially build up an army in which they will then use to try and attack and conquer Iraq, which is going to result in a failure simply because Iraq has the backing of Iran now with the fall of any really actually independent Iraqi statesman, as there has been no such a thing in existence since the fall of Saddam Hussein. Moving on to our critique, basically our disadvantage two. Disadvantage two is that nationalism right now is dangerous. As we saw with the Balkan Wars and things like that, basically what we saw is we saw all these small countries gaining this extreme sense of nationalism and pride, which thus resulted in many wars called the Balkan Wars, in which many people, many factions and many people tried to fight amongst themselves in order to gain some kind of independence and recognition from the diplomatic community. We can clearly see this as the 1992 war, the Kosovo War, in which Yugoslavia violently disintegrated and thus resulted in the massive killing. Moving on to our critique of the mindset of the affirmative. Basically, the links right here is the GAF operates on the fiat of the world that genocide is okay, which is clearly something that is not okay. The impacts of this is if we allow genocide, even by this extension with their plan, that it basically support the defenestration of the Kurdish culture. And so the alternative here is to vote for the negation to prevent genocide. So for all these reasons, there's a very strong vote in the negation. Thank you.
Alright, so let's go to the affirmative's first advantage. The negation's kind of reputation for affirmative's first advantage. Well, they wrote the example of North Sudan and South Sudan, how there exists an oil conflict in North Sudan and South Sudan, even after independence was declared from South Sudan, even after these two nations split. Apparently, the negation is trying to use this as a warning by saying that by using the North Sudan and South Sudan example, that if Kurdish Regional Government were to declare independence from Iraq, then we'd see the same situation. However, what we see in Kurdistan and or Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq is much different from what we see in North Sudan and South Sudan, because the fact of the matter is Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq are already separated by an ethnic barrier. As my partner brought up in his first speech, 75 to 80% Arab and 15 to 20% Kurds. So what we see is in the status quo, there already is a clear divide culturally and ethnically between the Iraqi Kurds and the Arabs of Iraq. So we can clearly see that because these two groups are there do exist differences. It will be much easier for independence to be declared and for independence to be recognized because of the different ethnic groups than it would be in North Sudan and South Sudan. So yes.
Can you tell me the last time there was a Kurdish independent state within the boundaries of our territorial Iraq?
A Kurdish independent state?
Correct.
Kurdistan, I don't know. The status quo, they are not independent, but they exist they are a federal entity. They exist under Iraq, and so they do have their own government, they do have their own parliament, but they are not technically independent. They're still part of the nation of Iraq. So essentially, the negative example of North Sudan and South Sudan cannot stand because the North Sudan and South Sudanese example does not take into account the ethnic differences that we see in between Iraqi Kurdistan and the Arab body of Iraq. The negative also brought up Iraq would be able to easily overpower any Kurdish effort at independence. However, in their first disadvantage, they brought up the idea that Kurdistan would build up an army and then go and conquer Iraq. So clearly you see a contradiction between the negatives arguments here, because they essentially are saying that Iraq is too powerful for Kurdish independence movement to occur. Yet at the same time, in their off case, they're talking about how Kurdistan will build up an army and conquer Iraq. You can't have both at the same time. They also brought up the example of Saddam Hussein and talked about, yes.
Is it possible for a nation state to build up an army, whereas an insurgency cannot?
So you're already saying that it is possible for a nation state to build up an insurgency, right? Because Kurdistan cannot become that powerful and build up an army unless you already assume that they can become independent from Iraq. So for the building up of an army to occur, you already are assuming under that world that Kurdistan does have the ability to overpower Iraq. So there still exists a contradiction in your points, if that makes sense. The affirmation, or the negation also brought up the example of Saddam Hussein. They talk about Saddam Hussein a lot and talk about nationalism. The fact of the matter is, nationalism already exists among the Kurds. My partner brought up the example November 26th, in which there was an armed conflict between troops in Baghdad and Kurdish troops. This is clear evidence that there already is nationalism and there already is violence occurring in the status quo. So the negations, arguments about how violence will be increased, are not actually unique to negation. But furthermore, what we see is that by passing the affirmative plan, we actually provide more incentive for less violence to occur, because now Iraq would stand to gain. In the status quo, Iraq is not getting any revenue from sales of Kurdish oil. Iraq doesn't like Kurdistan because of it, but they're not getting any revenue. But because of the affirmations plan, Iraq will be getting a share of the revenue of Kurdish oil. Therefore, they will be disincentivized from actually committing violence, because Iraq will stand to gain from the agreement of the affirmation plan. Therefore, violence will not actually be increased because the violence exists in the status quo. The affirmation plan will serve to decrease that violence by creating an agreement between Iraq and Kurdistan so that Iraq is happy and Kurdistan is happy. In response to the affirmative second contention, the negation brought up the example of more regional conflict, and it talked about making the Middle East more dependent on oil. The fact of the matter is, there is no real alternative to this, because in the status quo, Iraq is not going to become any less dependent on oil. The Middle East is not going to become any less dependent on oil, whether or not the Kurdish declare independence from Iraq or not. In fact, what we see is that oil dependency is not changed by the affirmative plan. So the negation's arguments about increasing oil dependency, the app plan doesn't actually affect that at all, so that has no impact. So if you look at, basically, if you look at the on case, if you look at the affirmative's original case, what we see here is that because Iraq will stand to gain from independence of Kurdistan, because of the agreements between Iraq and the newly independent Kurdish Regional Government that will allow Iraq to gain a share of the oil sales, and we see that not only are we going to be dissuading ethnic violence, but Iraq will be happy, and Kurdistan will be able to exist independently, and we will be able to eliminate the legal conflicts that currently exist in the status quo, meanwhile decreasing violence that occurs between Iraq and Kurdistan once they're able to reach an agreement. Now let's go to the off case. The disadvantages that the negation brought up, number one is leading to genocide. The negation isn't really bringing up any sort of brink here. Where is the point at which we are going to genocide? Are we already at the point that genocide is, if Kurdistan declares independence, that suddenly genocide will occur? The negative has not really brought up any reason why we should believe that at this current moment, that as soon as Kurdistan declares independence, that will automatically lead to genocide. So we cannot say for certain that we're that close to genocide. Even if Kurdistan were to declare independence, we have no reason to believe that that will necessarily lead to genocide. Also, their primary warrant for this was the 1991 Kurdish rebellion, in which Saddam Hussein committed genocide and whatnot. Keep in mind that was pre-Iraq war. So what we see is that with the removal of Saddam Hussein, after U.S. intervention in Iraq and foreign intervention in Iraq, such an occurrence is much less likely to happen with the newly reformed Iraqi government. And again, they brought an example of Kurdistan building up an army to therefore conquer Iraq. Again, you can see a contradiction between them stating that Kurdistan cannot conquer Iraq and has no power to declare independence from Iraq, and at the same time declaring that they will have the ability to build up an army and therefore counter Iraq. So you can see a clear contradiction here. The NEC has not provided a clear stance on what is possible and what is not possible, and so you cannot buy either of these arguments for litigation. And the second argument was the second disadvantage was the critique about how nationalism was dangerous. Keep in mind that this is not a unique link, because in the alternative, which is presumably the status quo, since the negative didn't really bring up what their alternative was, but since presumably the status quo, understand that this nationalism already exists. Again, go back to the November 26th example of Kurdish and Baghdad, the troops fighting against each other. Look to the ethnic conflict in which we see that 75 to 80% of Arabs and 15 to 20% Kurd, a clear minority. What we see is is that nationalism is existent whether we like it or not. And the fact that the Kurdish government already has its own parliament, I'll take no more points in this speech, I'm sorry. The Kurdish government already has its own parliament. It's not entirely autonomous, but has many elements of its own government and many elements of an autonomous government. The Kurdish government and the Iraqi government are already currently in a state where separation is not too difficult because Kurdish maintains so much autonomy, considering that it's actually a part of Iraq. And so what we see is that the idea of nationalism is already something that's latent in the status quo, and so the alternative towards increasing nationalism is not going to happen in the AF world and that. So what we see at the end of the day is that by passing the affirmative plan, we increase peace between Iraq and Kurdistan, we decrease ethnic conflict, and we decrease violence. And for that reason, we achieve net benefits on areas towards the affirmation.
Go over draft arguments and then off case on case. Okay, jumping right in. I want to bring up to the judge's attention that both of our observations went completely unaddressed in the round by the affirmation. So you as judges have to assume that both of our observations are true. The first one being that Kurdish independence is infeasible and unlikely because both they lack allies and they lack resources. This will become really important later on. Observation 2 is that Kurdistan as a country as an ethnic group exists in multiple countries. These countries are Iraq, Iran, Armenia, Turkey, and somewhere else. Syria, there we go, sorry. Okay, so this is really important because and I'll get to this when I get to my second contention. Okay, so jumping right into the neg case. Their refutations basically to our first contention that that their plan would lead to genocide is that they brought up a possible contradiction that they can't build up an army if they can't declare independence. But what we were saying as the negation was that if they were to, we're saying that it's unlikely that they can declare independence in the first place, but if they can, under the fiated world of the AF, because they're saying that they will declare independence, they will build a standing army with the intent of declaring war with Iraq, because of these long-standing conflicts. So we're not saying that this necessarily will happen, but or that it's necessarily possible, but they will have this intent leading, if you assume the fiated world of the AF, them declaring independence will happen. Okay, which is bad because they would inherently build up an army to attack Iraq. Okay, so moving on. They said that there would be yes.
Oh wait, so can you explain the warrant as to why the newly independent Kurdish government would be wanting to create an army to invade Iraq or to attack Iraq? What would be the incentive for that?
Okay, the incentive to attack Iraq, basically, there are multiple. The first one being long-standing issues with Iraq. Because, like what you've been saying, there are a lot of recent conflicts between the Baghdad government and the Kurdish people, as well as these long-standing issues that are coming up a lot lately, as well as oil negotiations and oil problems that have been going on, more for a longer period of time. It would give the Kurdish people an incentive to kind of take over the land that they think is theirs also. Okay, so moving on. They said that there is no brink that would lead to genocide. We're not saying that it would necessarily happen right away, but that the idea that having the Kurdish government be able to, or a newly independent Kurdish government would be able to, in the world of the negation in which they're not able to declare independence, they would just be stomped out by the Iraqis. This would this is the first kind of link to genocide. The second one is if they do manage to declare independence and they are able to create an army, they would inherently go to war with Iraq over both oil and standing cultural conflicts. Which isn't happening now because they don't have the ability to. I'm sorry. Can I ask you a question later? They're not able to in the status quo because they can't build up a standing army. Okay, so moving on to our second contention, which is that nationalism is dangerous. So they brought up the idea that nationalism already exists, but by having a independent Kurdistan, it would promote nationalism not just in Iraqi Kurdistan, but also with Kurdish people in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iran, as well as Armenia. So it would make it so that it would kind of say that it's okay for all of, it would promote the unification of Kurdistan as a legitimate country that they think they are, or at least that they claim that they are now. I'm not saying that they are, like, I'm not disregarding their ethnic separation, but just that, like, they are not an independent country right now, and by making Iraqi Kurdistan independent, it would promote the independence of the rest of the Kurdish nations, creating war, and making this nationalism, this Kurdish nationalism, very dangerous for the stability of the region. Okay, so it would only increase this dangerous nationalism. They didn't actually argue the dangerousness of nationalism, they just said that it already exists. So if we can prove that on the second contention that it increases this dangerous nationalism, then you have to vote for the negation on our second contention. Okay, moving on. They also disregarded our critique of the mindset of the affirmative. They just didn't bring it up at all. And this has to be a big voter in the round, because they're basically saying that it's okay for an affirmative, the affirmative or government to be genocidal and to get to like disregard the Kurdish culture, even though they seem like they're trying to help it. By extension, it either leads to the stomping out of Kurdish people because they're trying to declare their independence from Iraq. Obviously, Iraq won't like be okay with a large section, 18%, I think they said, some like. And that's a large section of the population of a country. That's a lot of people just leaving the country, as well as all of the economic losses that that Iraq will sustain by the independence of Kurdistan. Okay, so for these reasons, you have to vote for the negation and vote for the alternative of the status quo, because it doesn't lead to an inherent war between or the genocide of the Kurdish people in Iraq. Okay, moving on to their case. Their first contention was that it would kind of get rid of legal conflicts and decrease violence. This isn't true for a few reasons. The first of which being that, so their argument basically was that they're already separated by ethnic barriers, so that our empirical example of South Sudan and Sudan is irrelevant. But they've been ethnically separate for like thousands of years, and they haven't declared or they haven't been a separate country for a really long time. So obviously there isn't enough of a cultural difference for there to overwhelm the economic similarity as well as the geographic similarity between the two. It would lead to conflict between these two countries if Kurdistan were to declare independence, and we're saying as a negation that it's not really likely for them to be able to, just because they lack the resources and the allies to sustain a solid government, even if they aren't squashed by Iraq. Okay. Moving on to their second contention was that it stops new conflicts from happening. We want to impact turn and connect our second contention to their second contention here. Basically, the increase of nationalism in Kurdistan would increase conflicts in the region, not just in Iraq, but also in Turkey, which has like one of the largest standing armies in the region, and is the most likely to kind of stop this rebellion. So for all these reasons, I urge a strong vote in the negation.
It's name law.
Yes, sure.
So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for being here, because quite frankly, it's been a very rousing, good debate, and it's also been extremely educational. However, basically to clarify how this debate is going to be defined out, we're going to go and provide some voters as to why the negation is clearly won by providing an empirical example that we have the greater amount of net benefits, thus fulfilling a weighing mechanism, as well as why several points in our cases that have dropped, and those key points in those have essentially won us the debate. So now, basically, we're going to go ahead and move on here. So basically, we have both observations that went unrefuted throughout the round. And so, just to kind of refresh memories, is the observation one: fundamentally, an independent Kurdistan is not likely because it lacks resources and allies. So this is one example of So this is one observation that went unrefuted. And so then the second observation was that Kurdistan exists essentially in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. So now, essentially, what we have here is that we have all these observations which are accepted true by the affirmative, and because of this, we must use them to apply them logically throughout the entire debate. So now, if you look here, is that we've also won the greatest amount of net benefits. As my partner has demonstrated in the last speech, as well as I have in my previous speech, we have clearly impact turned nearly every single impact that basically all the net benefits that my opponents have laid out there, including the cessation of war between the individual states, as well as many other things. Such examples provided as we disassembled their refutation to our to our application of the Sudanese example of the scenario, as well as the Kurdistan nationalism train of thought, and why that would essentially be extremely dangerous for the Middle Eastern peace efforts. So now basically we're going to go over, so basically we turned all their net benefits and moved them over to the negations, so clearly we can claim all of them, including stability and economic development throughout the Middle East, including Kurdistan and the essential ending of some poverty in Iraq. Now we're going to move on to an our world versus their world analysis of how this debate boils down. So essentially in our world, the Middle East is relatively stable. Syria, Iraq, and Turkey have no motivation to completely exterminate the Kurds, which they could so do so, which they could in fact do so because they right now possess the hard power to initiate an extermination campaign, as happened in the 90s. And so because of this, we clearly have stopped this by providing no motivation, by providing nothing for the Kurdish independence. Now moving on to something else, they also just to kind of apply throughout this debate, is they did not actually address the critique on their mindset of genocide. And so because of that, you must vote for the negation based on basically to avoid their genocidal mindset that it's okay to commit genocide to further the aims of the people. Now, of course, we're going to go into their world. Basically, in their world, what we have is that we have a Kurdistan that's independent and it's out for blood. Why? Because of the 1991 extermination campaigns, which in fact happened during the Iraq War, because that's when Saddam Hussein was in fact at his weakest. You see, in 1991 and 1992, when the United States was invading Iraq, you can clearly see here the first Gulf War is that because that's when the Kurds decided to strike, was because the United States was launching a military offensive against Saddam Hussein in that war. They realized that it was time to strike, and thus they attempted to do so. Saddam Hussein was allowed to remain in power by U.S. President George H.W. Bush, and because of this, Saddam Hussein was able to recover an amount of power and to cause a massive exodus of Kurds outside, and so thus we see here is that the Kurds have the means with their nation state in the affirmative fiated world in which they have the means to assemble an army, and they have the motivation to in fact attempt to exterminate the Iraqis simply because of the genocidal war in 1991 and 1992. And so what you see here is that what you essentially see here is that you essentially see the means in the affirmative fiated world in which, because Iraq has permitted a nation state to essentially evolve out of northern Iraq, you see the nation state, which does in fact have a right to develop an army, and then you see the motivation in which to exterminate the Iraqis. So essentially, you can essentially see here the massive amount of bloodletting and bloodshed that would essentially result in the affirmative world. And that's essentially why you cannot vote for them, is because two things. One is that the amount of bloodshed, and two is the amount of genocide that would occur in there, and the genocidal mindset that they in fact endorse because they did not refuse to pay. Now essentially, if you wanted to just to kind of summarize everything, the net benefits in the negations world are far greater than the net benefits in the essentially in the affirmative world, simply because we provide for a mindset that is not genocidal. We provide for a non-independent Kurdistan that can still maintain its weak ethnic identity, simply because it's never been a nation state before, and simply because it doesn't actually have any real claims to independence, and we actually prohibit really any of this genocide from occurring. And essentially we can see here is that we clearly won on the net benefits weighing mechanism, as well as a number of other points that went unrefuted throughout the entire round. So clearly we can see here is that their only net benefits simply remain is their claim to poverty, which simply does not stand in this example, as we've demonstrated through basically empirical evidence and logic. And so because of this, I urge a very, very strong vote in negation. Thank you.
As a brief occupied roadmap, we're just going to be going over 5 main vote issues in favor of the affirmative. Opposition team ready? Go by voters. All right. The first main voter issue we had in favor of the affirmation is one that the whole argument about how nationalism is bad and how the affirmative actually wins this argument by saying that nationalism is good, right? Nationalism is good. The reason they warrant this and how they warrant that, saying that nationalism is bad, is by saying that there's a bunch of like different rebellions in different countries that have been caused because of a nationalist interest in gaining independence, and because of all those different rebellions that there's a lot of violence, and they say that that violence is bad. All right. So remember that that's not actually true. They're saying that like the whole violence between the actual people and Saddam Hussein was bad, and this violence was spurred by nationalism. But realize in the long term that nationalism will always be good, even if there's short-term violence that comes about. Saddam Hussein, the dictator, and like the people that he's being, he's dictating and having all these oppressions against. That violence that's coming about is short-term violence. In the future, when these people are free and sovereign and governing themselves, we can see that that's actually net beneficial because of the fact that they don't get into violence with other people in the future. So as a whole, violence goes down. And we can see that as a whole, democratic movements are good even if they have short-term violence. And they say that by saying that violence is or will come about as a cause of nationalism may be true to an extent, but in the long run, nationalism will always be good in making sure that the dictator isn't actually there as a whole. Right? So we win that argument as well. And so we realize the next thing they say is that there isn't really an incentive to actually be independent, how there's going to be negative implications. And remember that we give one example about the 1991 Kurdish rebellion against Hussein. Actually, they talk about that as well. But then we give you the November 26, 2006 military conflict example. All of these are reasons for why the people in Kurdistan are actually legitimately wanting to be independent. They're saying that the people actually don't want to be that much independent. They talk about how in refutation to our first advantage that they've already been ethnically separate and have no incentive or little incentive to actually be independent. Remember that that's not true because all of these conflicts came about as a result of ethnic diversity, as a result of not being able to be sovereign states. And so we can realize that in making this country independent, inherently we actually decrease the total number of violence. We decrease the total number of violence because people now have the ability to be sovereign and do as they please, and thus have also the oil independency as well, which is the next voter issue, is economic benefits. They talk about how we drop points, but that's actually not true. Remember that they drop the biggest thing. Not in one of their speeches that they talk about the actual oil contention we give you. They never talk about any of the disads of making sure that these two countries are independent so that oil trade can actually happen, right? So they talk about their main thing is that if they can show you that violence is increasing, that they should win. But realize that when we decrease poverty by making oil trades and oil trades between different entities like the Kurdistan people and foreign entities, when we make this available, poverty goes down. When poverty goes down, violence decreases. When people have economic sustainability, we ensure that violence is actually decreasing as a whole, and people have the ability to survive. People have the food that they need. All of this are things that decrease violence. And so making sure that these two states are independent, by this example, will show you that violence will decrease. And thus, this is a voter issue in favor of the affirmative side. So quality of life goes up, and that's a net benefit in favor of the affirmation, because at the end of the day, life will always be the biggest impact. If we can show that there's an increase in the quality of life, we've already showed you that violence will actually decrease as a result of making these two states independent. We realize that this will actually be very good, right? So the next argument they talk about, which is basically the thesis behind their case, and the core argument is this whole genocide argument, which is what their observation is based on. And they talk about how we don't refute this, but that's not actually true. My partner talked about how, one, that this is a non-unique argument because right now we realize that this one won't happen, right? Forget the non-unique thing, that's not even that important. This won't happen. They're saying that, just because they have the power to commit genocide because Saddam Hussein did it in the past, that they're going to do it in the future. Remember, that's not true. We have nuclear weapons, right? We hate North Koreans. Do we nuke them? Do we commit genocide? No. Just because, two different parties have an ability to kill people doesn't mean they will actually do it. And they're saying that they will do it because Saddam Hussein did it in 1991. That was before the Iraq and Afghanistan wars happened. That was before we put a democratic government into place. So remember that that's not true. So the foundation behind the very case is that genocide will occur if nationalism increases, but that's not true. We proved that wrong. And so the fourth main voting issue is the observations, and we talk about how they have no impact because they show no link at all between how a standing army will actually lead to genocide. And so remember that that's not true at all. The next main voter issue is that drop points. They never really address the oil contention. That's one of the main arguments right now, is that economic sustainability for both the Kurdish people and the Iraqi people in that state will actually lead to violence going down. Economic sustainability means poverty goes down. We already addressed this, but we'd like to capitalize on this because this is one of the most important issues. If we don't declare these two parties independent under constitution of Iraq, this actually can't happen. Trade between oil can't happen. People are still oppressed. People still can't do the trade and have the economic sustainability they want. So all of that benefits go in favor of the affirmation because we solve all of the standing problems that exist that we talk about, and all the voting issues are those in favor of the affirmation. Thank you.
That was very good.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you for a clean round.
Thank you for judging.